the face of a revolution. From the moment he stepped onto the screen, Marlon Brando didn't just act, he transformed the very language of cinema. When audiences saw him in A Streetcar Named Desire, 1951, they weren't watching a performance, they were witnessing a man bleed emotion, rage, and desire right in front of their eyes. As Stanley Kowalski, Brando was raw, physical, unpredictable. Then came Viva Zapata, 1952, where he played a revolutionary with fierce conviction. In Julius Caesar, 1953, he surprised critics with his powerful delivery of Shakespearean dialogue. And then On the Waterfront, 1954 arrived, a film that defined the decade and earned Brando his first Academy Award. With the haunting line, "I could have been a contender," he forever redefined what screen acting could be. By the time The Wild One, 1953, exploded into theaters, Brando was more than a movie star, he was a cultural lightning rod. Leather jacket, slouched posture, brooding eyes. His Johnny Strabler became the blueprint for the rebellious anti-hero. The 1960s saw him take risks with Reflections in a Golden Eye and The Chase, though some choices backfired. And then, after a quiet slump, came the thunderous return. The Godfather, 1972, stunned Hollywood. Brando, now older, heavier, and distant, gave the performance of a lifetime as Don Vito Corleone, winning his second Oscar, though he famously declined it in protest. Then came Last Tango in Paris, 1972, which sparked worldwide controversy and fascination. Later still, his shadow loomed in Apocalypse Now, 1979, where his brief scenes as Colonel Kurtz left an unforgettable impression. He finished his career with lesser films, but by then, it didn't matter. The revolution had already happened. What makes Marlon Brando so enduring is not just his work, but what he represented. He didn't fit into Hollywood's neat boxes. He didn't smile on cue or play the obedient star. He questioned everything, scripts, directors, the entire system. He didn't perform in the traditional sense. Instead, he embodied his characters with an honesty that startled both audiences and his peers. You could see the hurt in his eyes, the defiance in his stance, the vulnerability just beneath the anger. He was masculine without bravado, romantic without sentimentality, and always emotionally naked. His power wasn't just in how he delivered a line, it was in the silence between words, the twitch of his mouth, the way he'd shift his body like a wounded animal cornered by the world. With Brando, less was more. He didn't act for approval, he acted to uncover truth. And in doing so, he gave birth to the modern actor. But Brando's legacy goes far beyond the screen. He was a complex soul, brilliant, difficult, tortured, and compassionate. He used his fame to speak out for causes that mattered deeply to him: civil rights, Native American rights, and the environment. He turned down awards, refused interviews, and lived much of his later life in isolation. Fame, he once said, was a mask that eats into the face. Behind that mask was a man who had seen too much, felt too deeply, and carried wounds from both childhood and Hollywood. His personal life was often chaotic, marked by scandal, heartbreak, and unbearable loss. Yet through it all, his artistry never dimmed. Even in his final years, even in quiet roles, he carried the same fire that lit up his early work. This documentary is not just about a film career, it's about the life behind the myth. Over the next 25 sections, we'll travel from Brando's troubled boyhood in Nebraska to the acting schools of New York, from the sound stages of Hollywood to the political front lines of America. We'll explore his battles with directors, his complicated love life, his relationship with his children, and the tragedies that left permanent scars. We'll see how he created unforgettable characters and reshaped what actors could be. Not just performers, but emotional explorers. And we'll understand how a man who often wanted nothing to do with fame became one of the most iconic faces of the 20th century. More than anything, we'll try to answer a single question. What made Marlon Brando, Brando? What was it about him that turned him from a young rebel into a legend? Why does his influence still ripple through Hollywood decades after his final curtain? Why do actors today, from Al Pacino to Daniel Day-Lewis to Leonardo DiCaprio, still cite him as their greatest inspiration? The answer lies not in any single role or moment, but in the sum of contradictions he embodied. He was both the storm and the silence. He was the angry youth and the reclusive old man. He was the face of change and the soul of cinema. So as we begin this journey, remember, Brando wasn't just an actor. He was the moment the screen cracked open and something real came through. He was the turning point, the place where the old ended and something raw, dangerous, and beautiful began. Welcome to the story of Marlon Brando. Welcome to the revolution.
Early shadows, a troubled boyhood. In the chill of Omaha's long winters, where the wind cut through the city like a whisper of things unsaid, a boy named Marlon Brando Jr. came into the world on April 3, 1924. His home, though warm by bricks and hearth, was not a place of safety or joy. His father, Marlon Sr., was a man of stern discipline and sharp words, known more for his fists than his absences than any tender gesture. His mother, Dodie, was beautiful, artistic, and lost in a fog of gin and dreams she never reached. Brando, the youngest of 3 children, grew up in a house filled with tension, where silence was often louder than words, and a boy's spirit could break without anyone noticing. His sisters, Frances and Jocelyn, bore their own burdens, but it was young Marlon who had carried the heaviest load into adulthood. His mother had once dreamed of acting herself, performing in amateur plays and losing herself in the world of make-believe. But her days became slow and colorless, and the bottle replaced the stage. There were moments, fleeting, golden, when she'd recite Shakespeare to him in the kitchen or sing softly by the window. Brando would later recall those rare times as the only magic of his youth. But they were brief. More often he came home to find her passed out or gone. She was gentle when sober, but absent even when present, a ghost who wore perfume and sorrow. The boy began to understand, far too young, that love could fade like a photograph left too long in the sun. Brando's father was the opposite, too loud, too cruel, too demanding. He expected toughness from his son, scolding him for crying, mocking his sensitivity. When Marlon didn't live up to his standards, he was punished. Words turned to insults, and discipline often became something darker. The elder Brando believed in control, in hardening the soul like leather, but all it did was make the boy hide. Marlon became a mimic, a shapeshifter, using humor to deflect pain and silence to protect himself. He studied people the way a scout might study a storm, looking for signs, moods, patterns. That watchfulness would one day serve him well on the stage, but in those early days, it was a survival tool. School offered no refuge. He was restless, easily distracted, and angry beneath the surface. Teachers saw a lazy troublemaker, but inside, Marlon was churning, haunted by chaos at home, aching for something he couldn't name. He was sent to military school after being expelled from several public schools. Shattuck Military Academy in Minnesota was meant to make a man of him, but instead it gave him more walls, more rules, more cold mornings with no kindness. Still, he found pockets of escape. He acted in school plays, played the drums, and made friends who saw the charm under the rebel's scowl. Yet the wounds of childhood were deep and unhealed. His mother's drinking had worsened, and though she loved him in her way, she was slipping further from reach. When she was arrested for public drunkenness, it left a scar of shame he would never fully shake. When Brando left Shattuck without graduating, he drifted for a time, taking odd jobs, trying to find direction. But the ghosts of his boyhood followed. He was charismatic, but unpredictable. Warm one moment, guarded the next. His childhood had taught him not to trust love, not to expect constancy. That fear would follow him through relationships, through fame, through fatherhood. Yet strangely, it also gave him a gift, the ability to feel deeply, to understand brokenness, to wear pain like a second skin. When he finally stepped onto a stage, channeling forgotten sons and furious lovers, it wasn't make-believe, it was memory. Brando's troubled boyhood, forged in shadows and silence, did not end with childhood. It was the first act of a lifelong struggle with himself, with the world, and with the ghosts he could never outrun.
Escape to art. The stage calls. In the spring of 1943, Marlon Brando arrived in New York City with little money, a stubborn heart, and wounds from childhood still fresh beneath his skin. He was only 19. The war raged across the Atlantic, but Brando had declared himself unfit for military service due to a bad knee. Still, it wasn't the battlefield that called to him, it was the stage. New York, even then, pulsed with stories, with characters, with lights that never quite went out. In the chaos of it all, Brando sensed a chance to start over. He rented a small apartment, kept to himself, and tried to find out who he really was when no one was watching. He had no clear plan, only a burning need to express something that had been trapped inside him for years. That need led him to the New School for Social Research, where a new kind of acting was being taught: raw, emotional, real. It was there that he met Stella Adler, a teacher who would change his life. She had studied directly with Konstantin Stanislavski, the Russian master who believed that acting should come from truth, not tricks. Adler didn't care for fake tears or loud gestures. She wanted truth from her students, truth drawn from memory, imagination, and feeling. Brando was drawn to her like a moth to a flame. She saw something in him, a sensitivity hidden beneath his rough edges, a kind of emotional depth that couldn't be taught. Under her guidance, he learned to reach into his past, to find pain and joy and pour them into his roles. The process was not easy. It demanded honesty, it demanded courage. But for Brando, it felt like finally breathing after holding his breath for years. He studied obsessively. He watched, listened, mimicked life. He would sit in cafes for hours, not to drink, but to observe. How a man scratched his neck, how a woman fixed her hair when nervous. These little human details fascinated him. He believed that every person carried a story, even in silence, and he wanted to capture that on stage. At the Actors Studio, which he later joined, he refined this approach under the mentorship of Lee Strasberg and Elia Kazan. Though he would come to clash with Strasberg's interpretation of the method, Brando always credited Adler with grounding him. Acting to him wasn't performance, it was confession. When he walked on stage, he wasn't pretending, he was remembering. Each role became a mask and a mirror all at once. His breakthrough came with a role that burned itself into Broadway's memory, Stanley Kowalski in A Streetcar Named Desire. The part was brutal, raw, and dangerous, and Brando made it his own. He shouted, he slouched, he smoldered, but behind Stanley's rage, audiences sensed something wounded, something real. Brando's performance wasn't just new, it was revolutionary. People had never seen anything like it. The stage no longer felt like a safe distance between audience and actor. With Brando, the line was gone. It was as if he stepped out of the shadows of his past, carrying every bruise, every cry, every long silence from Omaha to the footlights of New York. Critics didn't know what to make of him. Some called it genius, others called it dangerous. Brando didn't care for praise or blame. He only cared that, for once, he felt alive. But acting wasn't just salvation, it was a form of survival. Even as he found success, Brando remained restless. He hated interviews, loathed rehearsed answers. He would often break character during practice, challenge directors, and walk out of auditions if he sensed phoniness. He refused to fake anything, on or off the stage. His devotion to method acting wasn't just about art, it was a way of coping with the contradictions inside him. He had been hurt deeply, and in acting, he found a way to channel the storm without drowning in it. Every role he played felt like peeling away another layer of himself. The escape into art became the beginning of his becoming. Not the end of his troubles, but the first real step away from them. And as New York embraced the strange, magnetic young man, Marlon Brando took his place not just on the stage, but in the changing heart of American theater.
The Wild One on Broadway. It began with a single role, but it would change theater forever. In 1947, Marlon Brando was cast as Stanley Kowalski in Tennessee Williams' A Streetcar Named Desire.
He was just 23 years old, full of fire and questions, still rougher on the edges. The play was directed by Elia Kazan, a sharp and demanding man who saw in Brando the raw power the role needed. Stanley wasn't just another character. He was a brute, a force of nature, a wounded animal who fought with his fists and loved with the same intensity. It was a role that required more than acting. It needed danger. It needed truth. And Brando, with his bruised past and aching soul, fit the part like a glove soaked in gasoline. The spark was lit. All that was left was to strike. Opening night was something people would talk about for decades. Brando stormed the stage not with polish, but with something closer to instinct. He moved like a panther, slouched like a factory worker, shouted like a man who never learned how to whisper. His voice wasn't crisp or trained, it was mumbled, broken, real. He didn't perform Stanley Kowalski, he became him, and the audience didn't know what hit them. Women gasped, men sat in silence. It was not just the rage that stunned them, it was the strange sadness beneath it. Brando's Stanley wasn't just cruel, he was human, hurt, frightened by change, hungry for power in a world he didn't understand. He shouted, "Stella!" with such force, such desperation, that the word didn't feel like a line, it felt like a lifeline. People in the theater world had never seen anything like it. Up until then, Broadway had been dominated by careful, theatrical performances. Actors projected their voices, stood tall, followed strict direction. Brando came in like a wild horse in a room full of marble statues. He scratched his belly on stage. He wiped sweat from his chest. He wore a torn t-shirt that clung to his muscles and revealed a kind of physical honesty rarely seen on stage. There was sex in his performance, yes, but more than that, there was chaos, controlled chaos. Brando brought the method to life. He dug into his own emotions, his own pain, and let them rise like steam off a cracked sidewalk. He wasn't acting to impress, he was acting to survive. Critics didn't know what to make of him at first. Some praised him as a genius, the future of American theater. Others found him too raw, too undisciplined, even vulgar. But the public responded. They came in droves, again and again, to watch this young man tear the stage apart. Tennessee Williams himself said Brando was the most gifted actor he had ever seen. His performance turned A Streetcar Named Desire into a strong play, into a cultural earthquake. And Elia Kazan, who had taken a chance on Brando, knew that something had changed. Theater would never again be that tidy, distant world it once was. Now, it had blood, it had sweat, it had Marlon Brando. For Brando, the success was both a gift and a burden. Fame came fast. Photographers chased him, reporters begged for interviews. Young actors watched him like hawks, trying to copy his slouch, his silence, his stare. But Brando, deep inside, remained restless. He knew he had done something powerful, but he didn't like the way people now looked at him. They wanted more of the wildness, more of Stanley. But Stanley Kowalski had come from a dark place in Brando's own soul, and revisiting it was never easy. Still, he had found his voice, not in words, but in the way he moved, the way he breathed, the way he felt on stage. Broadway had been shaken by a storm, and at the eye of it stood a young man with a troubled past and a new path ahead. Marlon Brando, the wild one of Broadway, had arrived, and the world was watching.
Storming Hollywood. Hollywood was not ready for him. In 1950, Marlon Brando walked into the world of film like a storm from the plains of his childhood, quiet at first, but with thunder behind his eyes. His debut came in The Men, a war drama directed by Fred Zinnemann. Brando played a paralyzed World War II veteran, confined to a wheelchair, filled with bitterness and shame. But he didn't just show up to set and act. No, Brando did something almost unheard of. He spent a month living in a veterans hospital in Van Nuys, talking to real patients, studying how they moved, how they suffered, how they fought to keep their dignity. He shaved his head, flattened his spirit, and gave a performance that was neither dramatic nor soft. It was just real.
and in doing so, he signaled the beginning of something new. Critics took notice. Brando was not polished like Cary Grant or clipped like Jimmy Stewart. He didn't play roles the way Hollywood stars had done for decades. He became his characters, awkward, angry, vulnerable. Watching the men, people felt uneasy, even disturbed. This wasn't acting made for glamour or applause. It was acting made from the bone and blood of real life. The camera lingered on Brando's silences, his clenched jaw, his haunted eyes. For the first time, film audiences saw a leading man who didn't sparkle, but smoldered. And even though The Men wasn't a box office smash, insiders knew something had shifted. The future had arrived, and it was wearing a plain army shirt, slouched in a wheelchair, speaking not with elegance, but with truth. The real explosion came the following year. A Streetcar Named Desire was brought to the screen in 1951, and Brando reprised his role as Stanley Kowalski. The performance he had first forged in sweat and rage on the Broadway stage now burned into silver nitrate. On film, his power became even more visceral. You could see the veins in his arms, the sweat on his chest, the twitch of a sneer before a word was spoken. The world gasped. Stanley wasn't just a character anymore. He was a cinematic earthquake. Brando's shirtless cry for "Stella" became a moment burned into American culture, imitated and echoed for generations to come. He didn't just act across from Vivian Leigh and Karl Malden. He challenged them, shook them, and sometimes even overpowered them. This wasn't just a film, it was the birth of a new kind of star. Old Hollywood didn't know what to do with him. He didn't smile for photographers or play the studio game. He mumbled in interviews, often refused to memorize lines, and demanded emotional honesty on every take. He didn't care about fame, he cared about truth. While others polished their public image, Brando roamed the sets barefoot, chain-smoking, scribbling notes in the margins of his script. Directors either loved him or feared him, but one thing was certain: nobody could ignore him. His presence on screen made older stars seem like echoes from a different age. The golden age of Hollywood, with its tidy endings, clean-cut heroes, and glamorous lighting, suddenly looked like yesterday's dream. Brando was a mirror to a darker, messier world, and people couldn't look away. By the end of the 1950s, Marlon Brando had become something larger than an actor. He was a force that had rewritten the rules. In just a few short years, he'd moved from promising newcomer to legend in the making. His performances weren't just roles, they were revolutions. Young actors like Paul Newman, Montgomery Clift, and James Dean watched him closely, studied his every move, and tried to catch the lightning he had summoned. Hollywood had once been a place of control and order, ruled by studio heads and stiff dialogue. Brando walked in like a storm, scattered the old ways like leaves in the wind, and planted the seeds of a new cinema, raw, intimate, and alive. And though he never asked for the crown, it had been placed on his head. The rebel had become the king.
A Streetcar Named Stardom. The fire truly caught in 1951. That was the year A Streetcar Named Desire moved from the stage to the screen, and Marlon Brando followed it, dragging with him a storm that would sweep across all of Hollywood. On Broadway, his Stanley Kowalski had already made audiences tremble, but the film version, directed by Elia Kazan, brought something even more dangerous to the world. It brought Stanley into people's homes, lit large on silver screens, loud, sweaty, and seething. There had never been a male character like him. Brando's performance was not safe or charming. It was raw and bruised, filled with wounded pride and barely restrained violence. And yet, there was something magnetic about him. Women were drawn to the ache behind his eyes, and men watched with unease, unsure if they were supposed to fear him or admire him. The story itself, adapted from Tennessee Williams' award-winning play, was already filled with pain. It told of Blanche Dubois, a fragile woman clinging to fading dreams, and her bitter clash with Stanley, her sister's brute of a husband.
The drama played out like a slow fall down a staircase, each step harder than the last. But what made the film unforgettable was not just the story, it was Brando. He didn't perform like others, he lived the role. His movements were unpredictable. His words, even when mumbled, felt like punches. And when he shouted, "Stella!" a howl of need and shame that echoed through darkened theaters, it struck deep into the bones of the audience. No one had ever seen a man act like that on film before. Not with such power, not with such pain. Behind the camera, it wasn't always easy. Brando clashed with Vivien Leigh, the British actress playing Blanche, who came from a classical acting background. She was precise, trained, and elegant. Brando was wild, natural, and intuitive. They were fire and ice, and that tension made the scenes between them almost too much to bear. Director Elia Kazan, who had worked with Brando on the stage version, knew how to push him, how to let him run free, but still shape the chaos into art. The result was a performance that critics and filmmakers still study to this day. Brando's Stanley wasn't a villain or a hero. He was something new, something terrifyingly human. When he lashed out, it hurt. When he was vulnerable, it ached. And in every scene, you could feel the pulse of a real man, not an actor playing pretend. When A Streetcar Named Desire was released, the film world changed. Brando was nominated for an Academy Award for Best Actor, and though he didn't win that year, the message was clear. The old ways of acting were dying. Gone were the stiff postures and dramatic hand gestures. Brando brought a new kind of honesty to the screen, one that came from inside the skin. His performance inspired a generation. Young actors like James Dean and Paul Newman watched him and understood that a new path had opened. Method acting, once a quiet revolution in theater, now had its first great prophet in film. Brando had shown what it could become, and audiences, for better or worse, were forever changed. From that moment on, Brando was no longer just an actor. He was a force. He had not only starred in a great film, he had transformed the art of screen acting itself. No one who watched Streetcar could go back to the old style. It was like seeing color for the first time after a lifetime of black and white. The image of Brando standing shirtless on the apartment stairs, bruised, sweating, and broken, is one of the most iconic in cinema history. He didn't just make Stanley Kowalski real, he made him unforgettable. And with that one role, Marlon Brando became a legend, not just in Hollywood, but across the entire world. The streetcar had arrived, and Brando rode it straight into stardom, leaving behind a trail of broken rules, haunted hearts, and burning film.
Rebellion in every role. The fire that A Streetcar Named Desire lit did not burn out. It roared even louder through the 1950s. Marlon Brando was no longer just a promising young actor. He was a storm tearing through Hollywood, and each new film was like thunder following lightning. In 1952, he played the Mexican revolutionary Emiliano Zapata in Viva Zapata, a role that showed his hunger for more than just fame. He didn't want to play safe or charming men. He wanted to inhabit firebrands, outsiders, broken heroes. Directed by Elia Kazan and written by John Steinbeck, the film painted Zapata as a man of the people, angry, noble, and betrayed by power. Brando trained with real peasants in Mexico, studied Zapata's life, and brought a quiet fury to the screen. For this role, he earned his second Oscar nomination. But the truth was already clear. Brando wasn't just acting anymore. He was chasing something deeper, some rebellion of the soul. In 1953, Brando shocked everyone again by taking a role few expected, Mark Antony in Julius Caesar. The idea of Brando doing Shakespeare made critics nervous. His mumbling, earthy style seemed a poor match for the polished, formal world of ancient Rome. But when the film was released, those doubts crumbled. Brando gave Antony a rough, passionate energy. His famous speech, "Friends, Romans, countrymen," sounded like a cry from the streets, not a lecture from a marble pedestal. He proved he could handle the classics, bending even Shakespeare to his will. The performance earned him another Oscar nomination. But more than that, it showed how deeply he understood power, betrayal, and grief. In every role, Brando reached for something real. Even surrounded by togas and swords, his acting felt raw. He wasn't performing for applause. He was telling the truth, however ugly it looked. Then came On the Waterfront in 1954, the film that would become his crowning jewel. Brando played Terry Malloy, a washed-up boxer working on the New Jersey docks, tangled in corruption, fear, and guilt. Directed once more by Kazan, the film was heavy with moral weight. It asked what a man owes to his conscience, his friends, and himself. Brando's performance was both tender and brutal. In one scene, he holds a dead man's glove, slowly fitting it over his own hand, silent grief made physical. In another, he sits in the back of a car with his brother, whispering, "I could have been a contender." That line would echo for decades. For this role, Brando finally won his first Academy Award. But even with that golden statue in his hand, he didn't smile for long. The weight of fame was starting to press down on him. He had climbed to the top of the mountain, but what was waiting there? By the late 1950s, Brando had become a reluctant king. He made more films, Guys and Dolls, The Tea House of the August Moon, and Sayonara, and each one showed his range, his magnetism, his restless spirit. He played gamblers, translators, lovers, and loners. In Sayonara, he played a U.S. Air Force officer who falls in love with a Japanese woman, challenging the racial prejudices of the time. The film was bold for its era, and Brando gave it grace. He kept pushing against limits, social, artistic, and personal. But fame, once a gift, had turned into a heavy chain. Crowds followed him. Reporters hunted him. The studios expected him to be a god in every scene. But gods, Brando knew, were not made for comfort. They burned fast and bright and were always alone in the end. Underneath it all, Brando was growing restless. The praise, the money, the power, it didn't fill the emptiness. He began to question the industry around him. He fought with directors, refused roles, rewrote scripts. To some, he seemed arrogant. To others, he was simply searching for truth, for meaning, for some peace that couldn't be bought with applause. He was an artist at war with himself. Every role he took was another battlefield. And though the 1950s crowned him the greatest actor of his generation, Brando seemed already half gone, tired of the spotlight, dreaming of escape. He didn't just play rebels, he was one. And as the decade closed, it was clear that Marlon Brando, for all his glory, was not content to stand still. The boy who once whispered to himself in a dark room had become a man who shouted truths from the screen. But inside, the rebel still stirred, restless, wounded, and forever chasing a freedom that no role could offer.
I could have been a contender. By 1954, the world no longer questioned Marlon Brando's talent. He had already shown flashes of greatness, on stage, on screen, in roles that shook the old bones of Hollywood. But On the Waterfront was something else entirely. It wasn't just a movie, it was a thunderclap. Brando played Terry Malloy, a dock worker torn between loyalty and justice, a man used and forgotten who finally finds the strength to stand up. The film was based on real corruption among longshoremen's unions, and every frame carried weight. Brando didn't perform the role, he lived it. He hunched his shoulders like a beaten dog, spoke in halting bursts, eyes full of guilt and hope. When he told his brother, "I could have been a contender," it wasn't just Terry Malloy talking, it was every man who had ever been cheated by the world. The film won 8 Academy Awards, including Best Picture and Best Director for Elia Kazan. But the greatest applause went to Brando. When he won the Oscar for Best Actor, it was no surprise. Yet for Brando, the win didn't taste sweet. In public, he smiled, but in private, he felt something hollow inside. That statue didn't erase the struggle. It didn't heal old wounds or silence the doubts. If anything, it made them louder. Now people expected perfection. He was no longer just an actor. They called him a genius, a legend, a force of nature. The spotlight burned hotter than ever, and Brando, who had always been uneasy with fame, began to feel trapped. The more people praised him, the more he pulled away. On the Waterfront had been personal in more ways than one. Elia Kazan, the director, had named names during the Hollywood blacklist hearings. Some saw the film as his way of justifying that betrayal, and Brando, who believed deeply in justice, struggled with that. Playing Terry, a man who testifies against corrupt union leaders, mirrored that moral conflict. It was a role that demanded honesty, even when it hurt. And maybe that's why Brando poured so much of himself into it. He knew what it was to carry guilt. He knew what it felt like to be torn between silence and truth. The line, "I could have been somebody," wasn't just a script, it was a mirror, and it left a mark on him that never quite faded. After On the Waterfront, doors opened everywhere. He could have taken any role he wanted, but something shifted. Brando didn't chase stardom the way others did. He turned down easy parts and clashed with producers. He grew frustrated with the Hollywood machine. It wasn't about art anymore, he believed. It was about profit. He saw scripts filled with lies, roles written for cardboard heroes, and he couldn't fake it. So he rebelled. He rewrote dialogue, argued with directors, demanded control. Some called him difficult, others called him brave. Either way, the golden boy of On the Waterfront was now walking his own road, one filled with shadows and solitude. The film may have marked the peak of Brando's early career, but it also marked the beginning of his retreat. He was still young, barely 30, but already worn down by the weight of expectation. That Oscar didn't just crown him, it cornered him. It told the world, this is as good as it gets. And Brando, restless as ever, hated being boxed in. He didn't want to repeat himself, he didn't want to coast, and so he drifted. Not away from acting, but away from the spotlight, away from the people who thought they knew him. In the years to come, his path would twist and fall, rise and break, but On the Waterfront would remain his monument, the proof that for one moment he stood at the very top. And from there, like all tragic heroes, he began his slow descent.
The cost of genius. By the late 1950s, Marlon Brando was no longer just an actor. He was a myth, a rebel with a voice like smoke and fire, a face that seemed carved from stone, and a spirit that refused to be tamed. But genius comes at a price, and Brando's began to show. On the surface, he had everything: fame, money, the freedom to choose his roles. Yet behind the curtain, storms were gathering. Directors who once begged for him now braced themselves. Producers whispered warnings. Brando, they said, was becoming impossible. He argued on set, rewrote scripts, showed up late or sometimes not at all. He refused to be controlled. He demanded truth in every line, every moment, and he would tear a scene apart if it didn't feel right. Some called it passion. Others called it pride, but no one doubted his power. His clash with directors became legendary. He fought with Joseph L. Mankiewicz during Julius Caesar, refusing to deliver lines like a stage actor. Instead, Brando spoke softly, naturally, turning Mark Antony into a real man, not a statue. Mankiewicz was furious until the final cut, when Brando's voice nearly stole the film. Later, during Mutiny on the Bounty, things grew worse. Brando showed up bloated, distracted, and defiant. He rewrote scenes, clashed with the British crew, and the production ran wildly over budget. What was supposed to be a grand adventure turned into a nightmare. Reporters fed on the chaos. Studio heads fumed. But Brando didn't blink. He believed in the work, his version of it anyway. He didn't care for rules. He believed the camera should capture truth, not polish. Some said he was sabotaging himself. He would walk off set if a scene didn't feel right.
He insulted co-stars, challenged directors, and even mocked the press. Yet in moments of honesty, those who worked with him admitted something strange. Beneath all the chaos, Brando was still chasing greatness. He didn't want to give half measures. He hated phoniness. When the script was weak, he tried to fix it. When the direction was lazy, he pushed back. Sometimes it worked, sometimes it didn't, but his commitment was real. In Reflections in a Golden Eye, The Chase, and other projects from the 1960s, you could see flashes of that old brilliance, a flicker in the eyes, a sudden stillness in the frame. He still had it, buried deep, but it was harder to reach now. The industry began to lose patience. The same man who once revolutionized acting was now seen as a risk. Studios hesitated. Offers slowed. Critics grew harsher. Brando retreated further into his private world, buying an island in Tahiti, surrounding himself with family, and slipping away from the spotlight. He claimed he hated acting, called it an empty profession, but that wasn't the whole truth. What Brando hated was the game, the lies, the control, the politics. He didn't want to be a product, he wanted to be an artist, and when that clashed with Hollywood's machine, it was Brando who paid the price. Not with talent, he never lost that, but with trust. Fewer people wanted to work with him, fewer believed he could still deliver. And yet, in his downfall, he remained unforgettable. Every time the industry tried to bury him, he left behind a ghost of what he once was. A line, a glance, a silence. The genius was still there like a flame under ashes, but it was hidden now, wrapped in anger, pride, and sorrow. This was the cost of brilliance without compromise. Marlon Brando had changed the world of acting, but he could not change himself. He refused to be tamed, even when it meant exile. And so, as the 1960s faded, Brando stood alone. Not forgotten, not finished, but waiting. Somewhere out there, beyond the noise of Hollywood, the next chapter waited like a wave on the horizon, and it would crash with the roar of a legend returning from the dark.
The Wild One, off-screen. By the time Marlon Brando became famous, it was hard to tell where his characters ended and where he began. On screen, he was fire and danger. Off screen, he was just as wild, riding motorcycles through Los Angeles streets, breaking hearts, and testing every boundary. After The Wild One hit theaters in 1953, the image of Brando in a leather jacket, slouched on a motorcycle, became a symbol of rebellion across the world. Teenage boys copied the look. Girls pinned his photo to their walls. But Brando didn't just play rebels, he lived like one. He wasn't acting when he challenged authority, questioned rules, or ignored polite society. He was being himself. And in doing so, he shaped a new kind of masculinity in America. Tough, moody, and unpredictable. Women fell for him in waves. Brando had relationships with actresses, dancers, and women from all walks of life. He fathered many children, some within marriage, others outside it. But love never stayed. He would charm, then vanish. He called himself emotionally distant, even broken. "I've never been able to trust anyone completely," he once said. Maybe it came from his childhood, marked by a distant mother and a hard-drinking father. Or maybe it was the curse of fame, how everyone wanted a piece of him, but no one really knew him. He often said he was happiest away from cameras and crowds. But even in silence, trouble seemed to follow. There were affairs, fights, and court battles. Tabloids chased him for years, painting him as a wild man who couldn't be tamed. Brando's interests stretched far beyond acting. He threw himself into politics and human rights. In the 1960s and 70s, when most stars stayed quiet, Brando spoke up, loudly. He marched with Martin Luther King Jr., supported Native American rights, and spoke against racism in Hollywood. When he won an Oscar for The Godfather, he didn't show up. Instead, he sent a young Apache woman named Sachin Littlefeather to reject the award on national television, drawing attention to the mistreatment of Native Americans. The audience booed. The press mocked him, but Brando didn't care.
He believed actors had a duty to use their fame for something bigger. He often said, "I'm not sure I'm an actor. I'm a human being interested in the world." That was the heart of him, a man searching for justice in a world built on shadows. Still, the line between his roles and his real life kept getting thinner. People thought of him as Stanley Kowalski, Terry Malloy, or Johnny from The Wild One. And in some ways, he acted like all of them. He could be soft, then suddenly violent. He could cry over a child suffering, then shout at a friend. He was made of contradictions, kind yet cruel, brilliant yet reckless. Directors and co-stars said working with him was like dancing on a volcano. You never knew when he'd explode. But when he was calm, he was the most generous soul in the room. He told stories, shared jokes, gave food to strangers, and listened when no one else did. The chaos was real, but so was the warmth. That was the strange, maddening beauty of Brando. He was both man and myth. As the years rolled by, his rebellion became heavier. His body grew larger, his voice slower, but the fire never left. He lived for a time on his private island in Tahiti, raising his children in peace. Yet even there, tragedy found him. Family struggles, the death of a daughter, and the violent crime involving his son. His past, his choices, and his anger all came back to haunt him. Still, he kept searching for meaning. He wrote, taught, argued, laughed. In his final years, Brando was a ghost of his younger self, older, wiser, and still untamed. His life was never clean or easy, but it was full of passion, pain, and purpose. He had been the wild one, on screen and off, and he never stopped chasing freedom, no matter the cost.
Love, affairs, and abandonment. There are men who love deeply, and there are men who love often. Marlon Brando was the second kind, a restless heart never satisfied by one embrace. Women fell for him like moths to flame, actresses, singers, models, even royalty. He had eyes that seemed to understand pain, lips that could charm gods or ghosts, and a voice like broken silk. Yet behind every affair, every seduction, was a man terrified of being seen too clearly. Brando once said, "With women, I've got a long line of regrets." And it was true. From his early fame in the 1950s through the last decades of his life, his romantic life was a long, uneven trail of passion, disappointment, and emotional retreat. He married 3 times, Anna Kashfi, Movita Castaneda, and Tarita Tarapaya, and had children with each of them. But love for Brando was never simple. He fathered at least 11 children, including Christian and Cheyenne, whose lives would later be scarred by tragedy. He also adopted and helped raise others, blurring the lines of what it meant to be family. Yet even with all these connections, Brando often stood apart, distant. He admitted he didn't know how to be a husband or father. "I didn't have a clue," he once confessed. "I was too busy running from myself." His own childhood, scarred by a cold mother and an abusive father, had left him adrift in matters of the heart. Love for him was both a need and a threat, something that could save him or destroy him. Still, there was no denying his magnetism. He had flings with Marilyn Monroe, Rita Moreno, and countless others. Some relationships burned bright and ended in chaos. His affair with Rita Moreno was volcanic, full of passion, betrayal, and even a suicide attempt. She later said he broke her heart more than once, but she kept returning, drawn by something she couldn't name. He had a way of making women feel seen and invisible all at once. Even when he tried to love honestly, his fear would rise like a storm and undo it. He seemed to believe that intimacy would cost him his freedom, so he seduced, withdrew, then searched for love again in another face, another touch. It was a cycle he could not escape, nor did he truly want to. His children saw both sides of him, the loving, playful father who could tell stories and make them laugh, and the distant, moody man lost in his own world. His relationship with Christian, his first son, was strained by Brando's absences and emotional detachment. Christian longed for his father's approval, but rarely felt it. Cheyenne, his daughter with Tarita, struggled even more. After years of emotional turmoil and the violent death of her lover at the hands of Christian, she descended into depression and later took her own life. Brando was shattered by these losses. He blamed himself. The pain aged him more than any role or headline ever could. Yet even in grief, he kept much of it buried, locked away beneath layers of silence and guilt. In the end, Brando's love life was like one of his greatest performances, raw, powerful, but hard to watch. He longed for connection, but didn't know how to hold on to it without breaking it. The same intensity that made him irresistible also made him unstable. He wanted to be loved, but on his terms, and that left most of those close to him hurt or confused. He was a man built for greatness, but not for peace. In love, as in art, he was a storm, beautiful, terrifying, and impossible to contain. And when the winds settled, all that remained were memories and questions.
The Island Drift, Artistic and Personal Exile. There comes a time in every great man's life when the fire begins to flicker. For Marlon Brando, that time came in the 1960s. The world around him was changing. New wars, new protests, new voices rising from the streets. Hollywood, too, was shifting, and Brando, once the rebel king, seemed unsure of where he fit. He no longer stormed across screens with the same fire in his eyes. Instead, he drifted. Some days he raged against the system. Other days, he simply vanished. He took roles not out of desire, but confusion, or perhaps boredom. His performances became uneven. Some were bold and strange, others dull and listless. The genius was still there, buried deep, but it no longer burned bright and clear. It began with the failure of Mutiny on the Bounty in 1962. Brando clashed with the director, the producers, and nearly everyone on set. He was accused of delaying the shoot, rewriting dialogue, and acting out of control. The film ran over budget, and critics tore it apart. Hollywood, once eager to crown him again and again, turned cold, and Brando turned away. He bought a private island in Tahiti, far from the spotlight and the noise. It wasn't just a retreat, it was an escape. He sought peace, simplicity, and distance. But islands can be lonely places. There, surrounded by the sea and silence, Brando began to disappear from the world that had once worshipped him. His body changed too. The man who had once electrified audiences with his strength and sex appeal began to gain weight. His once perfect features grew softer, heavier. His health slipped, and so did his confidence. He still worked, but the roles were odd choices, forgettable films like The Appaloosa, The Night of the Following Day, and Candy. He took paychecks for movies he didn't believe in. It was as if he no longer cared how he was remembered. Or maybe he feared he would never live up to what he once was. The sadness in his eyes grew deeper, and the laughter came less often. He became known as difficult, moody, unreliable. The firebrand of A Streetcar Named Desire was now a mystery to even his closest friends. He still found sparks of brilliance. In Reflections in a Golden Eye, he played a repressed army major, and in The Chase, he gave a raw, haunted performance. But these were exceptions, not the rule. His power came in flashes, not waves. Directors didn't know what version of Brando would show up on set, the artist or the ghost. He turned down major roles, including ones in Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid and A Bridge Too Far. He didn't chase stardom anymore. He wandered through his 40s like a man walking through fog. Fame had once been a crown, but now it was a chain. He preferred his island, his books, and silence. Some say he was protecting his soul. Others say he was lost and didn't know how to come back. And so the 1960s ended with Brando adrift, physically far from Hollywood, emotionally far from himself. The boy who had once fought his way into the world's heart had grown into a man who couldn't stand the world at all. The legend remained, but the man behind it had become a shadow. He wasn't finished, not yet, but the glow had dimmed, and the crowds had moved on. Still, the story was far from over. Even legends, broken and battered, can rise again. Brando would return, but not yet. First, he had to vanish completely.
The activist's voice. There are moments in history when a man speaks, not as an actor, not as a star, but as a soul unwilling to stay silent. In the early 1970s, Marlon Brando became that man. He had walked away from fame before, burned by its glare and weight. But now, instead of hiding, he chose to raise his voice. No longer content with pretending on screen, Brando turned his attention to the real-world dramas unfolding far from the cameras. Civil rights, racism, justice, these were the scripts he now cared about. He used his platform not for applause, but for protest. To the public, it was shocking. To Brando, it was necessary. He had seen too much to keep still. His activism began during the civil rights movement of the 1960s, when Brando marched with Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and supported the cause with money, words, and his presence. He attended rallies, gave interviews, and openly criticized segregation. When others in Hollywood kept quiet, Brando took risks. He turned down roles he felt were racially insensitive. He donated his earnings. He was even arrested during the fish-in protests in Washington, where Native Americans were fighting for their treaty rights. Brando's fame was a weapon, and he swung it hard at injustice. Friends warned him to stop, studios begged him to be quiet, but Brando wouldn't bend. He had grown tired of pretending the world was fair. Then came 1973, the year everything boiled over. Brando had just given one of the greatest performances of his life, playing Don Vito Corleone in The Godfather. He had transformed again, becoming a character larger than life, colder than death, and filled with quiet sorrow. When he was named Best Actor at the Academy Awards, everyone expected him to appear, accept the Oscar, and deliver a charming speech. Instead, the world saw Sacheen Littlefeather, a young Apache actress, step onto the stage in traditional dress. She spoke in his place, reading a statement from Brando, who refused the award in protest of Hollywood's portrayal of Native Americans and the recent events at Wounded Knee. The room fell into stunned silence. Some applauded, others booed. The moment became one of the most controversial in Oscar history, but Brando had made his point. He later explained that he could not, in good conscience, celebrate while Native Americans were being ignored, mocked, or mistreated, both on screen and off. His letter, printed in full later, was sharp and sorrowful. He spoke of broken treaties, violence, and the pain of an entire people whose stories had been erased by films like the ones he had once starred in. Critics called him arrogant, self-righteous, even crazy. But Brando didn't care. His cause was more important than his career. That act cost him dearly. Hollywood, always quick to forgive bad behavior, was not so kind to moral defiance. Some roles vanished, some offers dried up. Brando had challenged the very industry that made him a god. But he had also proven something few stars ever do, that his voice was not for sale. His heart, though bruised and buried beneath years of fame and loss, still beat with fury and compassion. And for that brief moment, Marlon Brando stood taller than any statue, brighter than any spotlight. He had become more than an actor. He had become a witness. Apocalypse on set. Legends are not only forged in success, they are often born in fire, chaos, and the madness of men who refuse to obey the rules. Marlon Brando, once the golden boy of Hollywood, had, by the 1960s, become a figure shrouded in contradiction. His talent was still undeniable, but so too was his unpredictability. During the filming of Mutiny on the Bounty in 1961, Brando's transformation into a storm on 2 feet began. He arrived in Tahiti like a king in exile, brilliant, bored, and bloated with ideas. He rewrote scenes, challenged the director, and clashed with the crew daily. The budget ballooned. The shooting schedule collapsed. Brando's behavior was called monstrous. But beneath it all, there was a man searching for something no script could provide: freedom. Mutiny on the Bounty became infamous, not for its story, but for its behind-the-scenes disaster. The film ran months over schedule and cost millions more than expected. Critics pounced on Brando's performance, calling it self-indulgent. MGM, the studio behind the film, blamed him for the chaos, and the fallout blackened his name for years. Yet, Brando shrugged it off like rain. He stayed in Tahiti after filming wrapped, bought an island, and withdrew from the world. To some, he had fallen. To others, he had escaped. In truth, he was drifting. A man too proud to be controlled, too gifted to be ignored, and too restless to stay still. Then came the 1970s, and with it, redemption. The Godfather had revived his image, but what followed was even stranger. Francis Ford Coppola, fresh from The Godfather's success, decided to adapt Apocalypse Now, a Vietnam War film based loosely on Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness. He asked Brando to play Colonel Kurtz, a shadowy, godlike figure who had gone mad deep in the jungle. Brando agreed for $3.5 million and a percentage of the profits. When he finally arrived on set in the Philippines, Coppola was horrified. Brando was bald, overweight, and hadn't read the script. He had his own ideas, and none of them matched what Coppola had envisioned. The set became a battlefield. Brando refused to say certain lines. He wanted to improvise. He wanted darkness, mystery, power. Coppola, already near a nervous breakdown from production delays and budget problems, had no choice but to adapt. He shot Brando in shadows, whispered lines, and cryptic monologues. Much of the film had to be restructured around Brando's presence, or lack thereof. What should have been a disaster became something haunting. Brando's Pertz didn't just act crazy, he was madness. And that madness echoed everything Brando had become by then. Genius wrapped in fog, unreachable but unforgettable. The phrase he murmured, the horror, became a chilling mirror to his own myth. When Apocalypse Now finally premiered in 1979, it was both a masterpiece and a warning. The film's beauty was carved out of pain. It had nearly destroyed its director, its crew, and its cast. But Brando's strange, shadowy performance left a mark no critic could erase. He had shown up unprepared, had pushed everyone to the edge, and yet delivered something people still talk about today. That was Brando. He made art the hard way. He never walked the easy road. His legend darkened in those years, like a hero turned ghost. But legends, even when broken, still hold power. In the end, Brando's clashes on set weren't just ego. They were the symptoms of a man who refused to be ordinary. He didn't want to play the same part twice. He didn't want to fake emotions. He wanted truth, even if it came wrapped in chaos. And chaos followed him everywhere. But so did greatness. Mutiny on the Bounty nearly ruined him. Apocalypse Now nearly ruined Coppola. But both films, one a mess, the other a miracle, remain stained with Brando's fingerprints. And so the myth grew darker, more complicated, more human. He wasn't just the greatest actor of his time, he was its most haunted.
The Godfather rises. By the early 1970s, many in Hollywood believed Marlon Brando's best days were behind him. His name, once golden, had been tarnished by flops, feuds, and erratic behavior. Studios feared him. Directors avoided him. He was seen as too difficult, too expensive, too unpredictable. Then came a story about an aging mafia don, a film based on a best-selling novel by Mario Puzo. Paramount Pictures was preparing to make The Godfather, but few believed Brando should be anywhere near it. He was too old, too troubled, too far gone. But Francis Ford Coppola, the film's young director, saw something others didn't. He believed only Brando could bring Vito Corleone to life. Getting Brando the role wasn't easy. Paramount executives pushed back hard. They wanted safer choices,
Ernest Borgnine, Anthony Quinn, even Laurence Olivier. But Coppola fought for Brando. The studio agreed, but only under strict terms. Brando would have to work for scale, put up a financial bond in case of delays, and, most humiliating of all, submit to a screen test. Brando, once the ruler of Hollywood, now had to audition like a newcomer. Yet when he did, magic happened. He stuffed tissues in his cheeks, slicked back his hair with shoe polish, and transformed before their eyes. He became Don Corleone, a man of quiet menace and buried sorrow. The studio had no choice but to say yes. Filming The Godfather was a tense experience. The production faced pressure from Italian-American groups, the real mafia, and even the FBI. But Brando was calm, focused, and professional. He showed up prepared, memorized his lines in his own strange way, writing them on cue cards, and gave Coppola few problems. His performance was like a storm building slowly on the horizon. He mumbled, whispered, and stared with eyes that had seen too much. His presence filled the screen, not with volume, but with gravity. Vito Corleone was no cartoon gangster. He was a tragic king, trying to protect a crumbling empire. Brando played him not with violence, but with sadness. He made the mafia human, and audiences couldn't look away. When the film premiered in 1972, it was nothing short of a cultural earthquake. Critics hailed it as one of the greatest movies ever made. Audiences lined up around the block. The Godfather became the highest-grossing film of its time. Brando's performance was instantly legendary. He didn't just save his career, he redefined it. The role earned him his second Academy Award for Best Actor, but in true Brando fashion, he didn't show up to accept it. Instead, he sent a young Native American activist, Sacheen Littlefeather, to decline the award on his behalf, as a protest against Hollywood's treatment of indigenous peoples. The act shocked the world and made headlines across the globe. Once again, Brando used his spotlight not for fame, but for fury. In The Godfather, Brando didn't just act, he cast a shadow across film history. He took what should have been a gangster role and turned it into something Shakespearean. Vito Corleone became a symbol of power, loss, and legacy. Brando had entered the story as a man many thought was finished. He left it as a god reborn. The film gave him new life, not just in Hollywood, but in the imagination of the world. Every actor who came after him studied that performance. Every director measured their work against it. And Brando, the rebel who had once sneered at the rules, had become the very foundation of modern acting. The Godfather wasn't just a comeback, it was a resurrection. And from that moment forward, Marlon Brando wasn't merely a star, he was legend.
The method defined. Marlon Brando didn't just act, he transformed. Where earlier actors had spoken their lines and hit their marks like polished machines, Brando stepped into his roles like a ghost slipping into someone else's skin. He didn't perform characters, he became them. This radical approach, later known as method acting, would change film forever. Born from the teachings of Konstantin Stanislavski and adapted at New York's Actors Studio by Lee Strasberg, method acting was about truth. It demanded that actors draw from real memories, raw emotions, and personal pain. Brando, under the guidance of Stella Adler, developed his own version of the method. And in doing so, he built a new standard that would ripple across generations. When Brando arrived on stage in the 1940s, his presence shocked audiences. In A Streetcar Named Desire, he didn't just say lines, he grunted, shouted, whispered, sweated, and sulked. He tore off his shirt, smashed plates, and let rage pour from him like steam from a cracked pipe. Critics called it animalistic. Audiences called it revolutionary. For Brando, emotion couldn't be faked, it had to be lived.
He would dig deep into his past, remember childhood pain, lost love or shame, and let those wounds bleed through the screen. He trained himself to never act in the traditional sense. If he didn't feel something, he didn't say it. If the words weren't true in his heart, he stayed silent. This made him unpredictable, but when it worked, it was magic. Brando's method was often invisible to others. He might read a line 50 times, looking for the one version that felt right. He would invent backstories, gestures, and inner thoughts for every character, even if they never made it to the screen. Before playing Terry Malloy in On the Waterfront, he spent days walking the New Jersey docks, studying the longshoremen, mimicking their slouched posture and mumbling speech. He stuffed cotton in his mouth to give his face a boxer's sag. He didn't wear the costume, he was the costume. Every detail mattered. He would even change the blocking of a scene if he felt the emotion was better served sitting rather than standing. Directors both loved and feared this. Brando could be impossible to control, but what he gave them on camera was gold. For Brando, vulnerability was the heart of acting. He believed that to be real, one had to be open, willing to cry, tremble, scream, or collapse. But this came at a cost. The deeper he went into his characters, the more his own identity blurred. He spoke often of how empty he felt inside, how he used acting to fill that space. The method gave him tools, but it also made him live every role as if it were part of his soul. That's why his performances felt like confessions. When he played broken men, it was because he too was broken. When he played proud men, it was because he understood pride as a shield against sorrow. It wasn't performance, it was exposure. Today, almost every serious actor owes a debt to Brando's method. From De Niro and Pacino to Joaquin Phoenix and Daniel Day-Lewis, his influence is everywhere. He taught them that acting wasn't about speaking clearly or hitting cues, it was about being honest, no matter how ugly or uncomfortable that honesty was. Brando never claimed to be a teacher, but his work became the lesson. He ripped the mask off the profession and showed the world what real pain, real joy, and real fear looked like on screen. And though many tried to imitate him, few ever matched the depth he reached. Because Brando didn't just define the method, he was the method. And that definition is still unfolding every time a new actor dares to bleed for the camera.
Private pain and public persona. The world saw a legend, but Marlon Brando saw something else when he looked in the mirror. A man scarred by guilt, hunted by his past, and trapped in a life too large to control. Fame never fit him well. It clung to him like a second skin he couldn't shed, even as it itched and burned. In public, he was the brooding rebel, the smirking icon with a voice full of velvet and thunder. But in private, Brando was often quiet, withdrawn, and painfully aware of his own broken pieces. The man who could bare his soul for the camera rarely let anyone close enough to see the damage when it wasn't rehearsed. His charisma was real, but so was the sadness hiding behind his eyes. Brando's depression followed him like a shadow. It wasn't always visible, but it was always there, waiting. He spoke, at times, about feeling empty, like he had been pretending for so long that he no longer knew who he really was. Acting had once been a form of escape, but by the 1970s, it became a burden. The more praise he received, the more pressure he felt to live up to something he never meant to create. He began to eat to dull the ache. His body grew heavier, slower. His eyes lost their fire. He isolated himself more, retreating into his home and then even further into his island in Tahiti, hoping perhaps to lose himself completely. But grief struck him harder than any critic or camera ever could. In 1990, his son Christian shot and killed Dag Drillette, the boyfriend of Brando's daughter, Cheyenne. The case became a media storm. Christian was convicted of manslaughter and went to prison. Cheyenne, already fragile, spiraled into deeper despair. In 1995, she died by suicide. Brando was shattered. He had always blamed himself for not being a better father, not being present enough, not giving his children the tools to handle the strange world they were born into. "The sadness is unbearable," he once said. The man who had moved nations with a single scene now sat helpless in the face of his own family's pain. He tried to use his fame to shield his family, but it was never enough. Reporters followed him everywhere. They turned his personal grief into tabloid headlines. Brando hated them for it. He once told Larry King that he hated interviews because they revealed too much, and yet not enough. They scratched at wounds but never offered understanding. He grew distrustful of almost everyone outside his inner circle. Even among friends, he often played roles, using humor or anger to keep people at a distance. He could be generous, yes, remarkably so, but he rarely opened the doors of his heart. Fame had made him a prisoner in a golden cell, and every smile he gave in public cost him something in private. Still, through all the pain, Brando never lost his humanity. He remained a man who could be deeply kind, fiercely loyal, and surprisingly humble. He spoke often of love, of wanting peace, of hoping for a world where people didn't have to perform to be accepted. He raised awareness for causes he believed in, even when it cost him work or reputation. He laughed when he could, cried when he had to, and spent his final years surrounded by a smaller circle of those who truly knew him, not the myth, but the man. And in the end, that's what Brando's life was, a war between the image and the soul. A man adored by millions, yet never quite at peace with himself. A giant on screen, but always searching for something smaller, softer, truer.
The family tragedies. Marlon Brando was no stranger to sorrow, but nothing in his stormy life prepared him for the heartbreak that would come from his own children. For all his success, all his money, and all the golden light that once followed him on stage and screen, Brando's greatest wounds came from within his own home. His son Christian and his daughter Cheyenne were born into a world of fame, excess, and emotional chaos. They carried his name, but also his demons. As they grew, Brando watched them struggle with identity, with pressure, and with the silence that always lingered between father and child. And then, in a single violent night in 1990, the Brando family story took a turn it would never recover from. Christian Brando, at just 32, shot and killed Dag Drillette, the boyfriend of his half-sister Cheyenne, in the family's Mulholland Drive home. The incident sent shockwaves through Hollywood and the world. Christian claimed he was protecting Cheyenne, who had told him she was being abused, claims that were never fully proven or dismissed. Brando stood beside his son in court, his voice shaking as he begged the judge for mercy. Christian was convicted of voluntary manslaughter and sentenced to 10 years in prison. Brando was never the same after that. He blamed himself for Christian's instability, for not being the father his children needed, for raising them in a house where emotions were deep but never fully spoken. Cheyenne, already fragile before the shooting, broke completely after Dag's death. She fell into depression, battled mental illness, and withdrew from the world. The once vibrant young woman faded before anyone's eyes. Her relationship with her father grew distant. She moved to Tahiti, isolated and adrift. In 1995, she died by suicide at just 25 years old. Brando was devastated. He had lost his daughter, lost the future she might have had, and lost yet another piece of his already fractured heart. He later said that her death took something from him that would never return.
The sadness that had always lived in the corners of his soul now stood center stage, unblinking and merciless. The press treated the tragedy like a circus. Paparazzi camped outside his gates. Headlines screamed about his family as if it were a TV drama instead of real grief. Brando, who had long resented fame's invasion into his private life, became even more guarded, even more bitter about the spotlight that wouldn't let him mourn in peace. He rarely spoke publicly about Christian or Cheyenne in the years that followed, but those who knew him saw the toll. He aged faster, his body grew heavier, his eyes darker. He kept fewer friends, took fewer risks, and began to retreat from the world altogether. For Brando, the great actor who had once commanded the screen with fire and beauty, these losses were wounds that no performance could cover. Still, beneath all the pain, he carried love. He never stopped caring about Christian, never stopped wishing things had been different for Cheyenne. He once said, "The only reason I'm alive is my kids." It was a raw confession, stripped of ego and pretense. Brando, for all his fame, had always wanted what many people want, to be a good parent, to love and be loved in return. But life had other plans. In the end, his family became both his strength and his undoing. And when the curtain began to fall on his life, the applause that once echoed for his roles could not drown out the silence left by those he had lost.
The Recluse of Mulholland Drive. In the final chapters of his life, Marlon Brando became a shadow of the man he once was, not in power or spirit, but in visibility. He retreated from the world that had once adored him, slipping behind the gates of his Mulholland Drive estate like a king withdrawing from court. The man who once electrified screens and captivated millions chose silence over applause. He lived alone much of the time, surrounded by memories, regrets, and the weight of years that had not been kind. Hollywood, once his playground and battlefield, became a distant noise he no longer cared to hear. His Mulholland home was less a mansion than a fortress, cluttered and private, filled with oddities and personal treasures that meant little to outsiders. He rarely entertained guests. He answered few calls. When people did visit, they often found him in worn robes or loose shirts, sitting in dim rooms filled with books and newspapers, speaking in riddles or long, wandering stories. He had always been eccentric, but now he seemed almost mythic, a man who lived in his own universe. He would talk about world politics, about lost loves, about the environment, about injustice, and sometimes about acting, but rarely about himself. That door stayed mostly closed. He no longer cared for stardom, and he didn't hide his feelings about the industry that had once crowned him. He saw Hollywood as shallow, cruel, and dishonest. To some, it sounded bitter. To others, it sounded like truth. He turned down roles, refused interviews, and rejected tributes. Once, when asked why he avoided awards shows, he simply said, "I don't want to be part of this hypocrisy anymore." His fame was a burden now, not a blessing. Even fans who spotted him on rare outings, heavily disguised in hats, sunglasses, or oversized coats, often couldn't recognize the legend beneath the layers. And that suited him just fine. Brando's health began to decline in the 1990s. Years of emotional strain, poor eating habits, and neglect took their toll. He struggled with obesity, diabetes, heart problems, and breathing issues. His body, once strong and magnetic, became frail. Yet even as his physical presence dimmed, his mind remained sharp, unpredictable, and full of fire. He would spend hours on the phone with friends, sometimes talking nonsense, sometimes diving deep into philosophy or poetry. He still had that voice, that unmistakable Brando murmur, part music, part thundercloud. But he laughed less. He smiled rarely. The losses he carried had hollowed out pieces of him that could not be replaced. Still, there was something tragic yet noble about Brando in these last years. He didn't chase youth. He didn't cling to relevance. He accepted his exile.
It was as if he had been preparing for it his whole life. A man who had played kings, rebels, boxers, and warlords had finally become what perhaps he always was, a wounded soul seeking peace. And when the end came on July 1st, 2004, it came quietly. No grand curtain call, no deathbed monologue. Just a final breath in a Los Angeles hospital, and the silence of a man who had given the world so much, yet always kept the deepest parts of himself hidden. Mulholland Drive would never be the same.
They called him many things: a genius, a rebel, a sex symbol, a god among actors. For decades, Marlon Brando was more than a man. He was a myth forged in fire and fame. He entered the world stage like a bolt of lightning, shaking up every idea of masculinity, performance, and stardom. On screen, he was raw and unpredictable, a living nerve. Off-screen, he was unknowable. People looked at him and saw power, danger, and desire. Directors feared him, actors worshipped him, women chased him. But like all legends, what the world saw was only half the story. The other half, the hidden man behind the curtain, was much quieter, lonelier, and far more human. Brando carried within him a terrible loneliness. It had followed him from childhood, where his alcoholic mother drifted in and out of awareness, and his father crushed him with scorn. That broken foundation never healed, not even when the world bowed at his feet. He longed for love but didn't know how to hold it. He sought meaning but couldn't stay still long enough to find it. His many lovers described him as distant. His children in later years recalled a father who was tender one moment, absent the next. He gave pieces of himself to roles, but struggled to give the same to the people closest to him. That was the wound Brando could never act his way out of. And yet the myth of Brando grew even as the man retreated. He was the wild one in a leather jacket, the mumbling Don with power in every breath, the wounded boxer, the tortured colonel, the last emperor of screen presence. People quoted him, mimicked him, deified him. He hated most of it. "The only reason I'm in Hollywood is that I don't have the moral courage to refuse the money," he once said. For every movie he took seriously, there was another he did for the paycheck. Even in his failures, the myth endured. No one else could fall as far and still be called the greatest. Toward the end, he spoke often about how little any of it mattered. Fame had been a trick, he said. Beauty, a burden. Talent, a curse. He believed that people confused his characters with the real man, and maybe that was true. Brando's greatness wasn't in his ability to pretend. It was in his ability to reveal something inside himself that most actors hid. But that same honesty came at a price. It left him exposed, vulnerable. He had never wanted to be a symbol. He wanted to be left alone. But symbols are not given peace, and myths are not allowed to rest. So now we are left with the story. A boy from Omaha who became the face of a revolution. A man who changed the craft of acting forever. A lover who broke hearts and had his own broken in return. A father who endured unbearable tragedy. A voice that still echoes through film history like a ghost in a cathedral. The myth of Marlon Brando will never die, but the man, complicated, fragile, and often afraid, has long been gone. And maybe in some quiet part of his soul, that's all he ever wanted: to stop performing, to simply be.
Time, like the tide, waits for no man, not even for giants. In his later years, Marlon Brando returned to the screen as a shadow of the man who once set it ablaze. His body had grown heavy, his voice more withdrawn, his eyes often tired. Yet behind the aging flesh still lived the furnace of a master, flickering, if not roaring. He made rare appearances, each carrying the weight of legend. But for Brando, acting had lost its magic. "Acting is a minor gift," he once said. "After a while, you want to say something with it, or not at all." He had become weary of the circus of Hollywood, the lies, the glitter, the expectations that no longer fit his aging soul. One of his final great roles was in The Freshman, 1990, where he played a parody of his most iconic creation, Don Vito Corleone. It was a strange loop in time, watching Brando mock himself, knowingly,
playfully. Critics were surprised by his humor, audiences amused by his timing. But beneath it was something sadder. A man wrestling with his own image, reclaiming control by poking holes in the myth he once tried to escape. In Don Juan DeMarco, 1994, he played a weary psychiatrist opposite Johnny Depp, offering warmth and quiet wisdom, like a king turned monk. It wasn't just a role, it was a mirror. Brando was aging, fading, but still present, still powerful. His last true performance came in The Score, 2001, alongside Robert De Niro and Edward Norton. On set, things weren't easy. Brando was difficult, unpredictable, often refusing to take direction from Frank Oz. At one point, he reportedly wouldn't even speak to the director, forcing De Niro to relay notes. He worked shirtless, sweat-soaked, insisting on comfort over convention. But when the camera rolled, the old magic flickered again, briefly, stubbornly, beautifully. Even in decay, he outshone others. Even with time against him, he still carved performances from stone. By now, Brando had turned inward completely. He rarely left his Mulholland Drive home. He grew reclusive, surrounded by memories, by ghosts, by regrets. The bright lights of fame no longer tempted him. His thoughts were with Polynesia, with activism, with the friends and family he had lost. He talked about death often, sometimes with fear, sometimes with indifference. "What are we doing here?" he asked in interviews. "We're all just farting around." He hid his pain with jokes, his loneliness with silence. In private, he wrote pages of reflections on acting, on America, on the emptiness of applause. These writings, never fully published, offer a glimpse into a man who had seen too much and understood too little of it in time. On July 1, 2004, the curtain finally fell. Brando died of respiratory failure at 80 years old. The world paused to remember him, not just the actor, but the phenomenon. News channels replayed The Godfather, Streetcar, On the Waterfront. His voice echoed again. His face filled the screen once more, reminding us of what he had given and what it had cost him. He had once changed the very soul of cinema, and now he was gone. But something of him remains, eternal as firelight. Every time an actor dares to feel, to tremble, to crack open his soul in front of the lens, Brando lives again. July 1st, 2004. The curtain falls. On a warm summer day in Los Angeles, the world quietly lost one of its brightest, most complicated stars. Marlon Brando died on July 1st, 2004, at the age of 80. The official cause was respiratory failure from pulmonary fibrosis and congestive heart failure. There were no final speeches, no last dramatic gestures, just a fading breath in a hospital room, surrounded not by cameras, but by silence. The man who once shook the walls of cinema slipped away like a whisper. It was a strange, almost fitting end for someone who had spent much of his life running from the very spotlight that had made him immortal. Brando had been battling illness for years. His body, once full of power and grace, had become frail and tired. He had suffered from diabetes, liver failure, and other ailments. Food became both comfort and enemy. Movement was difficult. He spent his last years mostly in seclusion, talking only to close friends, reading and reflecting. He didn't chase attention, he didn't give interviews, he rarely appeared in public. He had seen too much, felt too much, and carried too many burdens. The death of his daughter Cheyenne, the imprisonment of his son Christian, these wounds never healed. They weighed on his heart more than any illness ever could. Yet in those final years, Brando remained curious. He still questioned the world, still wrote down thoughts in journals. He was obsessed with truth, always had been. He wanted to understand why people hurt each other, why fame was so hollow, why art mattered, and why sometimes it didn't.
"The only reason I'm in Hollywood is that I don't have the moral courage to refuse the money," he once said, brutally honest, often to his own disadvantage. He had never been simple. Even dying, he remained a riddle wrapped in shadow. When news of his death broke, it felt unreal. Could Brando really be gone? The world had grown used to his silence, but not to the idea that he would never speak again. Tributes came slowly at first, then in waves. Some remembered the rebel, others the artist, many the damaged soul who had given too much of himself to roles and too little to his own peace. For all the headlines he once made, his death was strangely quiet, almost unnoticed by the world he once dominated. There was no state funeral, no massive gathering, just a few friends, a private cremation, and ashes taken to Tahiti, where part of his heart had always lived. Brando's life was never neat, never easy. He was a man of contradictions, bold and shy, fearless and wounded, loved and feared. But in death, something settled, the noise faded. What remained was the legacy. A voice that changed how actors spoke, a presence that redefined what it meant to feel on screen. A life full of pain, love, genius, and ghosts. The curtain had fallen, but behind it, the echo of his truth still lingered.
The echo of Brando. After Brando's death, the world took a breath and then began to remember. Not with statues or monuments, but with voices. Actors, directors, critics, and ordinary fans all shared stories of how he had changed them. For some, it was the way he made raw emotion feel holy. For others, it was the way he destroyed every rule and made something new. Al Pacino called him the only actor I ever looked up to. Jack Nicholson said, "There's really been nobody like him." And Johnny Depp, who had once shared the screen with him, called him the Godfather of modern acting. The praise was deep, not because he had been perfect, but because he had been real. Brando didn't just act, he exposed. He tore his chest open and let the world see what was inside. That courage, that madness, gave birth to a whole new generation of performers. De Niro, Pacino, Hoffman, Penn, all of them followed in his path. Even actors who never met him studied him. His early roles were required viewing in film schools. His voice, his silences, his twitching hands, they became sacred language. He made characters live not just through dialogue, but through stillness. You could watch him sit in silence and still feel the storm inside. Yet Brando's impact went beyond the screen. He showed that an actor could be more than a puppet. He could be a voice. His refusal of the Oscar in 1973 in protest of the treatment of Native Americans shocked Hollywood. But it also made people listen. He stood up when it wasn't convenient, when it wasn't safe. He turned down millions when he didn't believe in the story. In an industry that rewards obedience, Brando was a fire that wouldn't be tamed. That defiance became legend, and legends, when told enough, become the bones of culture. Fans, too, kept him alive. On social media, in tribute videos, in whispered conversations and acting classes, Brando's name stayed lit. His quotes were passed around like scripture. An actor is at most a poet and at least an entertainer. The only reason I'm here is because I don't have the courage to be somewhere else. People didn't just admire him, they identified with him. With the man who hurt, who loved, who failed. He was proof that greatness could be broken and that brokenness could be great. Today, Brando is not just a memory, he's a presence. Every time an actor dares to be vulnerable, dares to show fear or ugliness or hunger, Brando is there. Every time a performance breaks convention or makes people uncomfortable with how honest it feels, his shadow flickers behind it. He didn't want worship. He didn't even want fame. But he got something stranger, something deeper. He became the echo in every great performance since, the voice that doesn't fade, the face that won't vanish. The soul of the craft, still restless, still burning.
The art of being real. There was something raw and unsettling in the way Marlon Brando performed. It wasn't just talent, it was something deeper, more dangerous. He didn't act, he became. Long before the industry had terms like emotional authenticity or character immersion, Brando was living inside the souls of the men he played. He revolutionized acting with what is now known as the method, but for Brando it wasn't a method at all. It was survival. It was the only way he could make sense of the world, by slipping into someone else's skin and telling a truth that felt more honest than his own life ever did. Brando's influence on method acting is not just lasting, it is towering. Every generation since has studied his choices, his pauses, his silences. Al Pacino once said watching Brando was like witnessing magic. Robert De Niro, Jack Nicholson, Daniel Day-Lewis, they all walked the path Brando cleared. He made it acceptable for actors to be vulnerable, broken, complex. Before him, masculinity in film was stiff and postured. After him, it had depth, pain, contradiction. He introduced a kind of realism that made audiences uncomfortable because it was too close to life itself. But this gift came at a cost. Because Brando was so good at feeling, he was also haunted by it. He couldn't turn it off. His acting bled into his life, and his life bled into his acting. There was no border. His emotions didn't rest between takes. Directors spoke of how difficult he could be on set, but it wasn't just ego, it was torment. He felt everything too much. That sensitivity, so brilliant on screen, often left him shattered in private. As time passed, Brando became less interested in Hollywood's games. He saw the industry as false, its awards meaningless, its politics exhausting. He believed truth mattered more than fame, and his work reflected that. Even when he starred in lesser films later in life, there were always flashes of that original fire, those piercing moments when he delivered a line or moved his eyes and reminded everyone that no one else could do what he did. Not really, not completely. In the end, Brando gave the world something it didn't even know it needed: the courage to be emotionally real on screen. That was his legacy, not just in the movies he made, but in the countless performances shaped by his shadow. In every actor who dares to bleed on camera, there is a little Brando. He made art more human, and in doing so, he made cinema more alive.
The immortal voice. When Marlon Brando was laid to rest on July 1, 2004, the world didn't just lose an actor, it lost a storm. His passing felt like the end of an era, not because he had been so visible in his final years, but because his silence had always spoken louder than most people's noise. He had become a legend long before his death, and with death, he became something greater, a symbol. A reminder that greatness is often uncomfortable, that genius is rarely clean or easy, that true artistry demands a piece of your soul. In the days and weeks after his death, tributes poured in from across the world. Some called him the greatest actor of the 20th century. Others spoke of his defiance, his rebellion, his fire. Younger performers confessed how his performances shaped them, even if they never met him. Directors who had once cursed his name now praised his brilliance. For all the trouble he caused, he was unforgettable. His performances, Vito Corleone, Stanley Kowalski, Terry Malloy, Colonel Kurtz, stood like monuments in the history of cinema, towers of feeling, ghosts made of film. But beneath the public legend was a man broken by time. Brando spent his last years mostly alone, battling health issues, reflecting on a life that had burned too brightly and too fast. He was overweight, in pain, grieving still for the children he had lost and for the dreams he had abandoned. He no longer cared for the spotlight. He knew it could never give back what it took, but he remained curious, always questioning, always searching. Even when his voice grew weak and his body frail, his mind stayed sharp. His hunger for truth never left him. That hunger, raw, burning, endless, is what made him eternal. It lives in every performance that dares to go deeper, in every actor who takes risks, in every scene that leaves us shaken. Brando didn't teach the world how to act, he taught the world how to feel. And in an age of spectacle and surface, that is a kind of immortality all its own. There will always be actors, but there will never be another Marlon Brando. So we return to the beginning, the voice, that soft, raspy whisper full of power, that half-muttered dialogue that shook the foundations of film, the voice that changed acting forever, that made characters feel like people, and people feel like poetry. Marlon Brando didn't just act, he echoed. Through decades, through generations, through time. The man is gone, but the voice is immortal.